The planet of Zarkora hung quietly in the dark expanse of space, its lush green forests and vast oceans hidden beneath the dark clouds swirling in the sky. It was a world full of promise, a peaceful civilization, thriving for centuries. But that peace was now shattered. The Zorkalians, the planet's inhabitants, had never imagined their time would come. Never thought they'd be forced to defend their homes from an enemy so brutal, so relentless. Oh, but they had learned, painfully, that peace meant nothing to everyone, especially to the Exyrians. Exyrians were a war-hardened species, driven by the UHE, thirst for conquest. Their ships were massive and deadly, their weapons capable of tearing through entire cities with a single strike. They had arrived on Zarkora like a storm, sweeping through the planet with relentless force, wiping out everything in their path. The Zorkalians had tried to fight back, but they were no match for the might of the Exyrian fleet. The Zorkalian High Command was desperate. They needed help, any help. So, against the advice of many, they did something they swore they would never do. They sent out an SOS. It was a simple message, broadcast across the stars, sent from the heart of their capital city, Zorkal, a cry for help, broadcasted with urgency. This is Zarkora. We are under attack. We request immediate assistance. Any species that can hear us, we need help. Our survival depends on it. The message was brief, but it was enough. Enough to reach the ears of any species who had the courage to help. What the Zorkalians didn't know was that their signal had traveled far, further than they could have ever imagined. And in its journey, it would catch the attention of something they could not foresee, light years away on a different part of the galaxy. The signal was intercepted by a massive, imposing fleet of ships. These ships were unlike anything the Zorkalians had imagined. They didn't belong to any known allies or peaceful species. The fleet was made up of monstrous, battle-scarred ships, their hulls painted with the markings of countless victories. These were not peaceful explorers or compassionate travelers. They were the Deathworlders, a name whispered in fear across the stars. The Deathworlders had a reputation that sent chills down the spines of even the most powerful empires. They were a species born in the fires of war, a race that had conquered world after world. Their home planet was a harsh, unforgiving place where only the strongest survived. Their fleet was just as brutal as their home. The leader of the fleet, Captain Carroll, sat in the command center of his flagship, the Blood Torrent. His cold eyes scanned the vast expanse of space ahead. But it was the faint pulse of the Zorkalian distress signal that caught his attention. He leaned forward, his fingers tapping the armrest of his throne-like chair. "What have we here?" he muttered to himself. His officers gathered around him, awaiting orders. There was no need for a discussion. The Zorkalian signal had come through loud and clear. But it wasn't a typical distress call. It wasn't the call of a species seeking to join the Deathworlders in conquest. It wasn't an invitation for alliance or trade. It was a cry for help. Carell's lips curled into a cruel smile. They are weak, he thought. They fear us. They want a bargain. Let's see how they respond when they realize what we are. The Deathworlders had never come to the aid of any species. They didn't offer assistance. They took what they wanted. Carell had no intention of changing that now. His fleet would respond not as saviors, but as conquerors. With a cold command, he gave the order. Prepare to intercept the signal's origin. We will answer their call our way. Back on Zarkora, Alara stood in the control room of the Zorkalian High Command. The entire city had been plunged into chaos. Buildings were shaking under the constant bombardment from above. The sky was dark with smoke from the constant attacks of the Exyrian fleet. Her mind raced as she paced in front of the holographic map of the planet. The Zorkalians had fought valiantly, but the Exyrian fleet was simply too strong. Cities had already fallen. Entire fleets of Zorkalian warships had been destroyed in space battles. They were losing. The SOS had been their final hope. But who would come? Who could come? Zarkora wasn't part of any major galactic alliance. They had no powerful allies to call upon. Captain Alara, a voice broke through her thoughts. She turned to see Lieutenant Oren standing at the doorway, his face pale with worry. "The signal has been sent. We are waiting for a response." Ilara nodded but didn't speak. Her eyes were still fixed on the hologram. She could feel the weight of the situation pressing on her chest. What if no one answers? The seconds felt like hours. Then, suddenly a flicker on the console caught her attention. It was a response. A fleet had appeared on their sensors. Zarkera's defenses had no idea what to make of it at first. This wasn't a Zorkalian fleet, nor was it Ixirian. The ships were enormous, far larger than anything the Zorkalians had ever seen. It appeared to be a mix of battle-ready warships. An unrecognizable technology. A new wave of panic swept through the control room. Who were these ships? Were they friend or foe? Message was received, and it chilled Ilara to the core. The speaker crackled to life, and a voice, low and menacing, filled the room. "This is Captain Carroll of the Deathworlder fleet. We have received your distress signal. Prepare yourselves for our arrival." Ilara's heart stopped. She stared at the console, her breath catching in her throat. "The Deathworlders," it answered, "but not as allies." She turned to Lieutenant Oren. "No, this can't be right. They're here to conquer us." Before he could respond, the ground trembled beneath their feet. The rumble of the approaching fleet shook the building, and the sky above lit up with the fires of war. Above Zarkora, the Deathworlder fleet appeared out of the void of space. Enormous ships with blood-red hulls and jagged spiked metal cut through the atmosphere like a nightmare come to life. They were not here to help. They were here to destroy. The Zorkalians had made a deadly mistake. They had called for help. They had never expected the Deathworlders. Captain Carell smiled again, his cold eyes gleaming. The Zorkalians were weak, their planet ripe for the taking. The Deathworlders didn't care about diplomacy or alliances, cared only about survival and taking what they wanted. The Zorkalian fleet attempted to scramble to intercept the incoming threat. It was too late. The Deathworlders had already positioned themselves in orbit. There was no escape. In the control room, Ilara's worst fears were confirmed. The Deathworlders had arrived, and they weren't leaving without a fight. As the warning sirens blared, and the first of the Deathworlder ships opened fire on the city below, Ilara made a decision. She had to act quickly. Prepare the fleet. Need to evacuate the citizens and fast. We don't have much time. But as she spoke, she couldn't help but wonder. Would it even matter? The Deathworlder fleet was unstoppable. No one knew. If the Zorkalians would survive the storm that was about to crash down on their world, the answer, Ilara feared, would come too late. The sky above Zarkora was painted with the glowing streaks of incoming Deathworlder ships. The ground shook as their massive engines burned through the atmosphere. Each ship, like a fiery fist, aimed directly at the heart of Zerk, Ara, in the control room of Zorkalian High Command. Lara's mind raced. She could hear the warning sirens blaring, the air thick with the smell of burning circuits and panic. Outside, the first waves of enemy fire began to strike the city, sending plumes of smoke and dust into the air. It was a nightmare of the kind, a battle no one could ever prepare for. "Captain, we're losing contact with the outer cities." Lieutenant Oren's voice was frantic as he monitored the damage. Display in front of her. The Deathworlder fleet had appeared out of nowhere, their ships larger than anything the Zorkalians had ever seen. Zarkera's defenses had already begun to buckle under the pressure. "We need to rally the resistance," Ilara said, her voice sharp despite the chaos around her. "Can't just wait for them to tear us apart." Oren nodded, but his face was pale. He knew just as well as Ilara that rallying the resistance would take more than just a few brave souls. It would take every last soldier, every last ship they had left. "We don't have time," Captain Oren said, his voice dropping. "We're outnumbered and outgunned. The Ixirians were bad, but this... this is worse. We're facing a species that has conquered entire galaxies." Ilara's thoughts flashed back to the moment she had first heard the distress signal. They had sent out a plea for help, and now they were paying the price for it. They cared only about destruction. Her hands gripped the control panel, nails digging into the metal. She couldn't let Zarkora fall. Above Zarkora, The Deathworlder fleet loomed like a storm, ready to break. It was a symbol of death, its crimson hull, scarred with the marks of countless wars. Inside the ship, Captain Carell stood on the bridge, his cold eyes fixed on the planet below. He was calm, but beneath that calm was a deep, ancient hunger for power. He had waited for this moment for too long. Report. Carell's voice was low, but carried an air of authority that made the officers around him flinch. We are in. Position, Captain, one of the officers said, pointing to the screens. All systems are online. The Zorkalian defenses are crumbling faster than we anticipated. Their fleet is retreating, and the cities are already under attack. Carell smiled. It was a savage, predatory grin. Good, let them run. They will not escape. He turned, his gaze to the planet below, imagining the destruction that awaited. The Zorkalians thought they could ask for help from anyone. But they didn't know that calling out to the wrong species could bring about their own extinction. They will. Learn, Carell muttered to himself, his eyes gleaming with a dark excitement. No one escapes the Deathworlders. She knew the enemy was too strong, but there had to be something, anything she could do to turn the tide. Lieutenant, get me a direct line to General Vorn, she ordered. We need to start evacuating civilians. The ships can't hold out much longer, and we can't afford to lose our infrastructure. Yes, Captain, Orin replied, rushing to relay the order. As he worked, Ilara watched the holographic map. Flicker, it was a grim pictures. Arkara's outer cities were already falling. The Deathworlders were taking no prisoners. Ilara's heart sank as the data showed the total casualties rising rapidly. While Zarkara's defenses melted away under the weight of their overwhelming assault. How much time do we have? She asked, voice steady despite the terror mounting. In her chest, not much, Orin said, glancing at the map again. Maybe a few hours before the Deathworlders reached the capital. Was about to issue another order. The lights in the control room flickered. The whole building shook again this time, with the force of an impact. Captain, the Deathworlders are targeting the central power grid. It was only a matter of time before they were completely overrun. Get me a team, she said urgently. We'll defend the power grid. It's our last hope. But as she turned to make her way toward the exit, another voice stopped her in. Her tracks, Captain Ilara. She turned to see a Zorkalian technician running towards her, his face white with fear. What is it? Ilara demanded, her heart racing. The technician was breathless, his eyes wide. The Deathworlder ships. Ilara felt her stomach drop. Reinforcements? From where? Technician swallowed hard, shaking his head. There's more. At that moment, a transmission came through on there. Comes a deep, prepare yourselves. For extinction, Ilara clenched her jaw. There was a whole fleet on the way. We don't have much time, Ilara said, her voice hardening with resolve. Prepare the last line of defense. We fight or we die. Above Zarkora, the situation continued to escalate. The Deathworlder fleet was about to drop down on the planet like a hammer, and nothing could stop it. Captain Carroll's plan was simple. Made a terrible mistake. And now they would pay the price. As Carroll's fleet descended on the city, the first bombs began to fall. In the streets of Zorkora, panic erupted. Civilians scrambled to reach underground shelters, while soldiers fought desperately to keep the Deathworlders at bay. The Deathworlder ships above unleashed wave after wave of destruction. Fought with the last ounce of their strength. There was no other choice in the heart of the capital. Time, they could hear the explosions in the distance. Keep moving, Ilara shouted, her voice steady, though her heart was pounding in her chest. They had no idea how much longer they could hold out. The streets of Zorkara's capital city were a battlefield, a scene of chaos and destruction. Everywhere Ilara looked, there were flashes of light, the deafening sounds of explosions, and the cries of civilians trying to escape. The Deathworlder. Ships loomed overhead, their massive forms blocking out the sun as they unleashed a steady stream of fire on the city below. Ilara's boots pounded against the crumbling streets as she led her team toward the power grid station, the only place left that could power the city's defenses. The air smelled of smoke and burning metal, the once beautiful buildings now reduced to rubble. Zarkarah's proud capital had become a war zone, and time was running out. "Captain, we're almost there," Lieutenant Orrin called, his voice strained but determined. Ilara nodded but didn't stop moving. Behind her, a small group of Zorkalian soldiers and engineers fought to clear the path. They were all that remained of the once proud military of Zarkora. The rest had already fallen, or worse, had fled. The power grid station was located near the center of the city. It was the last line of defense, a place where Zarkera's entire energy supply could be directed toward its planetary shields and weapons. If they could get there in time, they might be able to slow the Deathworlder assault and buy the citizens enough time to escape to the underground shelters. But the odds were slim, as they reached a broken-down corner near the station. The unmistakable sound of enemy ships overhead grew louder. The Deathworlder fleet was closer than ever, and their weapons were firing indiscriminately on the city's last stronghold. "Ilara, we need to move faster," Orrin urged, his voice urgent. "The grid is their next target. If we don't get—" "There, I know," Ilara interrupted, her jaw clenched in determination. She could see the station in the distance now, barely standing, a glowing beacon of hope amidst the devastation. But it was surrounded by enemy forces. Their soldiers were marching through the streets, picking off anyone who was still alive, leaving nothing in their wake but destruction. "We'll have to fight our way through," Ilara said. "Stay sharp, everyone." We stayed data. They said they did data. They pressed forward, ducking behind fallen debris for cover as they advanced. The Deathworlder forces were methodical in their approach, each step measured, their weapons silent but deadly. It was clear that they weren't just here to destroy Zarkaroth. They were here to send a message. The team crouched behind a collapsed building, watching as a group of Deathworlder soldiers marched past. Their armor was dark and angular, their weapons sleek and terrifying. These soldiers were like ghosts, moving with unnatural precision, their eyes scanning every corner for any sign of resistance. Ilara held her breath, watching as one of them paused nearby, sensing something amiss. The air seemed to freeze, the tension thick enough to cut. But then, by some miracle, the soldier continued onward, unaware of the small group just a few meters away. "We move now," Lara whispered, signaling to her team. They darted from cover to cover, avoiding detection by the Deathworlders. Every step was a gamble. But with the power grid station so close, they had no choice but to push forward. Above them, in the shadow of the looming Deathworlder fleet, Captain Carroll stood on the bridge of the Blood Torrent, watching the chaos unfold below. His heart beat with cold anticipation. This was the moment when Zarkora would learn the price of calling the Deathworlders for help. The planet was already burning. His fleet had already devastated the outer cities and was now zeroing in on the last resistance. But Carell wasn't interested in merely watching his enemies burn. He was a conqueror, and he relished the hunt. He turned to his second-in-command, a tall, imposing figure with cybernetic enhancements. "Send the ground forces," Carell ordered. "It's time to finish this." "Yes, Captain," the officer replied, deploying troops now. The Deathworlders were not just an army, they were a nightmare in physical form. As Carell watched his troops descend toward the city, he felt a twisted sense of satisfaction. The Zorkalians had made the mistake of asking for help. Now they would be shown that the Deathworlders offered no help, only destruction. Ilaris' team had made it to the outer walls of the power grid station, but it was heavily guarded. 2 squads of Deathworlder soldiers stood between them and the entrance, their weapons at the ready, their eyes scanning the area for any sign of movement. Ilara knew this was it. This was their last chance. "Captain, we can't take them all on," Orrin said, his voice tight with fear. "We're outnumbered." "We don't have a choice," Ilara said, her voice cold. "We fight or we lose." Zarkora. Her heart was racing, but her resolve was unshaken. This was it. Their last stand. Ilara turned to her team. On my mark, we charge. Use everything you've got. If we fall, at least we fall fighting." As the team nodded, readying their weapons, Ilare's mind raced. She had never imagined it would come to this, fighting for their survival in a city on the brink of collapse. Zarkera's survival depended on them, and as much as she feared what might happen next, there was a fire inside her, now, fire that wouldn't be extinguished, no matter what. "Now," Ilara shouted. The group burst out of cover, charging toward the Deathworlder soldiers. Gunfire erupted, the sharp crack of Zorkalian blasters mixing with the deadly thrum of Deathworlder weapons. Ilara's team moved with the precision of veterans, ducking, diving, firing as they fought their way through the enemy lines. The Deathworlders were formidable, but Zorkalians were desperate. Their blasters tore through the air, finding their targets even as the Deathworlders retaliated with brutal efficiency. But as the battle raged, Ilara realized with a sinking feeling that they were losing. The Deathworlders were simply too powerful, too numerous. The Zorkalians might have the will to fight, but they didn't have the firepower to win this fight. And then, just as Ilara was about to give another order, a massive explosion rocked the area. The ground shook violently beneath her feet, and she stumbled, barely managing to keep her balance. From the smoke and dust, a new force emerged, a wave of Deathworlder reinforcements. Carol's ground forces had arrived. They were everywhere. Now, Ilara's heart sank. The last line of defense had just collapsed, but still, she held her ground, back in space. Carol's flagship loomed over the planet like a predator circling its prey. The city below was now nothing more than a smoldering ruin. The cries of Zorkalian soldiers and civilians, drowned out by the booming explosions and the relentless pounding of his fleet's firepower, the Deathworlders had come to conquer. And they would leave nothing behind but ashes. Report. Carell's voice was a low growl. "It's over, Captain," one of the officers said. "The city has fallen. Zarkora is ours." Carell nodded, satisfied, but not content. There was still one more task to complete. "Send a transmission to the Zorkalian survivors," Carell ordered. "Let them know that this is what happens. When you call the Deathworlders for help," he smiled coldly, "there's no escape. Not for you. Not for anyone." Zarkara's capital city was a wreck. Once beautiful buildings were now mere skeletons of their former selves, smoking ruins dotting every street corner. The thunderous explosions still echoed through the broken air, and the skies above were darkened by the silhouettes of Deathworlder ships as they loomed ominously overhead. Captain Ilara and her team had pushed forward as far as they could, fighting for their lives. But now they were out of options. Ilara crouched behind a shattered pillar, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Her heart was pounding in her chest. The Deathworlders had poured into the city from every direction, their numbers overwhelming, their firepower unmatched. Even with every ounce of Zorkalian resolve, they were losing. The city was lost. "Captain." Oren's voice trembled as he approached, his face smeared with blood and dirt. His eyes were wild, frantic. "It's hopeless. They're everywhere. We've lost the power grid. We've lost the outer districts. If we stay here, we'll be caught in the crossfire." Ilara didn't answer right away. Instead, she stared at the smoking horizon, where her people had once lived in peace. Zarkora had always been a planet of beauty and prosperity, jewel in the galaxy. But now, it was nothing more than a battleground. The Deathworlders had come to claim it, and no one had ever warned her of the price of asking for help from a species like them. For the first time in a long while, Ilara felt something she hadn't expected. Fear. Fear not just for herself, but for her people. They were fighting to the bitter end, but the fight was slipping away from them. "Ilara." Captain Oren's voice cut through her thoughts. "What now? You can't keep going. They've won." Ilara closed her eyes for a moment, forcing herself to think clearly. Oren was right. They couldn't keep fighting forever. The remaining Zorkalian forces were spread too thin, and the Deathworlder reinforcements were still arriving.
Ow.
If they didn't do something drastic, the city and everything they fought for would be lost. We retreat, Ilara finally said, her voice low, but firm. She turned to the rest of her team, her gaze sweeping across the remaining soldiers. We take what's left of the resistance, and we fall back to the underground shelters. The civilians are there. We need to get them out before the Deathworlders destroy the entire city. Orin looked at her in disbelief. Retreat? We're leaving? After all this? I don't like it any more than you do, Ilara replied, her voice tight with frustration. But we don't have a choice. If we stay here, we'll be slaughtered. If we retreat, we may have a chance to live and fight another day. Zarkora may fall, but we'll make sure the Deathworlders remember it wasn't easy. She could see the reluctance in Orin's eyes, but he didn't argue. He knew she was right. They were outmatched, outnumbered, and outgunned. But they weren't out of time, not yet. Above Zarkora, the Deathworlder fleet continued its relentless bombardment. Captain Carroll stood at the helm of the Blood Torrent, watching with cold detachment as his forces carried out their orders. The city was nearly broken, its defenses in ruins. There were only a few scattered pockets of resistance left, but Carell wasn't concerned. His forces would crush them in due time. Report, Carell said, his voice calm but firm. Sir, the city's shields have failed, his communications officer replied. We've broken through their last line of defense. All major targets are destroyed. The Zorkalian forces are in disarray. Carell nodded slowly, his lips curling into a savage smile. Good. Let them flee into the tunnels. It won't matter. We'll have this planet within the hour. He turned away from the view screen, eyes gleaming with satisfaction. Zarkora would be another addition to the Deathworlder Empire, a planet laid to waste for the simple crime of calling for help. The Zorkalians had hoped for allies, but they had awakened the wrong kind of species. But even as Carell prepared to give the order to finish the final assault, something caught his attention. One of his officers was approaching him with urgent news. Captain, we've received an incoming transmission from Zarkora. Carell's eyebrow raised in curiosity. From Zarkora? At this point, it's nothing but a pile of rubble. From the Zorkalian High Command, the officer continued, glancing at the screen. It's a message, a final plea. Carell's lips curled into an amused smirk. A final plea? How pathetic. Shall we respond, Captain? We're really stared at the officer for a moment, a glint of amusement in his eyes. No. Let's leave them to their misery. They've already received the message they needed. The officer hesitated, but Carell's order was clear. Very well, Captain. We'll resume the attack. As Carell turned back to the viewport, he couldn't help but feel a rush of satisfaction. This was what he was made for. The destruction, the conquest. The Deathworlders were the apex predators of the galaxy, and no one, not even the proud Zorkalians, could escape their wrath. Back in the streets of Zarkora, Ilara led her remaining soldiers through the ruins of the city, their path guided by the faint glow of emergency lights and the distant hum of explosions. They moved quickly, but they couldn't escape the weight of the devastation around them. The city was burning, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. As they neared the underground shelter, Ilara saw the first signs of life. Groups of civilians huddled in the tunnels, fear written on their faces. It was a haunting sight. Once proud population of Zarkora reduced to survivors, struggling to escape the fury of an unstoppable enemy. Ilara, a voice shouted from the crowd. Zorkalian elder pushed through the throngs of people, his face wrinkled with age and fear. Is it true? Are we abandoning the city? Will we survive? Ilara took a deep breath and stepped forward to meet him. She looked into the faces of the people she had sworn to protect and felt the weight of responsibility on her shoulders. We will survive. Ilara said firmly, though the uncertainty in her heart gnawed at her. Zarkora may fall, but as long as we have life, we will fight, we will rebuild, and we will make them pay. The elder nodded solemnly, but there was a flicker of hope in his eyes. Then we fight with you, Captain. Ilara turned to Orin, her resolve hardening. We gather the last of our forces, leave no one behind. Orin nodded, the fire in his eyes rekindling. Yes, Captain, we fight. But even as they made their way to the depths of the shelter, Ilara couldn't shake. The feeling that Zarkara's fate had already been sealed. They had called out for help, but had received only destruction in return. And she knew the Deathworlders weren't done yet. The worst was still to come. Above them, the Deathworlder fleet circled, ready to finish what they had started. Voice echoed in the empty corridors of the blood torrent, ordering his forces to prepare for the final strike. This was not a war. This was a slaughter, and Zarkora was already lost. Zarkara's underground shelters were a far cry from the world above. The air was thick with the smell of damp concrete and the staleness of desperation. Civilians huddled in groups, faces etched with terror, while soldiers stood guard, ever watchful. Their world had shrunk to the dark, underground tunnels fleeing the firestorm above, where the Deathworlders tore apart everything in their path. Alara's boots echoed through the cold. Metal halls as she walked the corridors, her mind racing. She had just spoken to the civilians, giving them hope where she knew none could truly exist. But even as her words reassured them, her heart weighed heavy with guilt. The city was gone. Her people were gone. Zarkora would never be the same. And all they had now were these tunnels. Ilara Oren's voice broke through her thoughts as he caught up to her. His eyes were tired, his uniform torn and burned. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. We've gathered as many as we can. The remaining forces are regrouping. She nodded without looking at him. Her focus was on the map projected in front of her. What about the civilians? She asked. They're hiding in the deep tunnels. They're scared. Some want to leave, but the Deathworlder forces are too close. They know they can't go. Back! Alara exhaled sharply, her fingers brushing against the cold metal of the map's surface. They had no time left. If they didn't act now, there wouldn't be anyone left to save. She could hear the distant sound of Deathworlder ships in the skies above, their engines humming ominously. The final wave was coming. The Deathworlders aren't just going to stop, Oren continued, his voice strained. We can't keep running forever. We need to find a way to fight back. Alara turned to him, her gaze hard, and we will. But we need more time. We need to gather our strength. He looked at her, brow furrowed, before his gaze shifted to the map once more. And what about the power grid? We could access it from underground. We might be able to turn on the planetary shields again. Maybe even use the remaining weapons. Alara considered this for a moment. The power grid station had fallen to the Deathworlders hours ago. But there was still one path leading into it, a secret maintenance tunnel, hidden beneath the city's surface. It was a long shot, but it was there. Only shot. We take the tunnel, Ilara said finally. We get to that grid, and we make them pay. We're not finished yet. Above Zarkora, on the bridge of the blood torrent, Captain Karel stood with his arms crossed, staring out at the planet below. His fleet had broken through all of the city's defenses, and now the last of the Zorkalian resistance was cowering. In the tunnels, he could feel the weight of their desperation, even from this distance. We've won, his second-in-command said, standing beside him, tone of satisfaction in their voice. The surface is ours. The survivors are trapped. Shall we move forward with the final cleansing? Karel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he watched the smoldering wreckage of what had once been Zarkora. His mind wasn't focused on the final blow. It was on something more. Satisfying, no, Karel finally said, a smile curling at the edges of his lips. We let them suffer. They called for help, and they brought ruin to their own doorstep. Let them scurry in their tunnels like rats. He paused, a deep satisfaction settling over him. But we'll send them a message, a final message that they won't soon forget. He turned to his officer. Prepare the last of our fleet. We're not done yet. In the dark tunnels beneath the city, Alara's team moved quickly, their weapons drawn and their eyes scanning every corner. They'd gathered the remaining survivors, but they could only move in small groups. The Deathworlders had been relentless in their assault, and now their forces had the tunnels surrounded. There's no way we can take them all on, Lieutenant Oren whispered. There are too many. Even if we get to the grid, we're walking straight into their jaws. Jaw tightened. I know, she replied, her voice low. But we don't have a choice. This is our last chance. They moved silently, sticking to the shadows as much as possible. The sounds of distant footsteps echoed in the tunnels, growing louder with every passing second. Ilara could feel the pressure building, the feeling of being hunted, of knowing that one wrong move could mean the end. She couldn't help but wonder if this was how it had all been meant to end. Zorkalian people had asked for help, and now they were paying the price for their mistake. But Ilara wasn't going to let them die without a fight. She couldn't. She wouldn't. They reached the maintenance tunnel without incident, though the silence in the air was suffocating. As they made their way deeper, Ilara's thoughts turned to what awaited them. The Deathworlder fleet would stop at nothing to claim Zarkora, and even if they could manage to activate the planetary shields, it might not be enough. "We're close," Orin whispered. "The entrance to the power grid is just ahead." Lara nodded, signaling for the team to stay quiet and alert. They were getting closer, but there was one more obstacle between them and their goal. The Deathworlder forces patrolling the area. Karel sat in the command chair of the Blood Torrent, a slow, calculating smile playing on his lips. The last pockets of resistance were being crushed, and Zarkora would soon be under his complete control. "I want the message sent to the Zorkalians below," Karel said, his voice low. "Tell them that they will never be allowed to forget the cost of their foolishness. We have come to destroy, and we will leave nothing behind." His second in command turned to him, a hint of hesitation in their eyes. "Captain, the survivors." "Let them live," Karel said, his tone cold. "But we'll make sure they never forget this day." He turned to the communications officer. "Send the message. Let them hear our voice as we claim their world." "Why?" Low hum filled the bridge as the transmission was sent, broadcasting across every channel. The words were simple, direct, and devastating. "Zarkora has fallen. The Deathworlders have come. You called for help and we answered, but you did not ask for this. You will never escape. There is no refuge. There is no peace. You are ours." Karel leaned back in his chair, his eyes gleaming with satisfaction. It was done. Zarkora was broken, but below, Ilara and her team were on the move, closing in on the power grid. They knew time was running out. They had to act quickly or they would be the last to die on Zerk. As they neared the grid entrance, Ilara could feel the weight of their mission bearing down on her. This was their last chance to save Zarkaria if they could get the shields back online. They might be able to hold off the Deathworlder fleet long enough for the survivors to escape, but they would have to face the Deathworlder forces head-on, and they would not be merciful. "Ilara," Orin whispered as he looked ahead, "they're waiting for us." Ilara nodded grimly. "Then we fight." The corridors of the power grid station were dark, with only the dim glow of emergency lights illuminating their path. Lara and her team moved quickly, their hearts pounding in their chests. The sound of distant footsteps echoing through the tunnels was constant now. The Deathworlders were closing in. Time was running out. "We can't go much further," Orin whispered, his voice tight with anxiety. His hand gripped his rifle, knuckles white. "We're going to run right into them." Lara turned to him, her eyes steely with resolve. "We have no choice, Orin. This is the only way." Behind her, the remaining soldiers battle-worn and wary looked to her for guidance. Their faces were drawn, their bodies exhausted. Yet despite the overwhelming odds, they stood ready to fight. They had no other options. With a final nod, Ilara led them forward, reaching the entrance to the power grid room. It was locked, but she knew the access code. The door slid open with a soft hiss, revealing the dimly lit control center within. At the center of the room stood the main console, the heart of Zarkora's planetary defense system. If they could reactivate the shields and the planetary weapons, they might stand a chance, but the moment the door opened, they knew they weren't alone. The Deathworlders had anticipated their move. Karul had ordered his forces to set up a trap. The moment Ilara and her team entered the room, they found themselves surrounded. Tall, armored figures in black combat suits filled the room, weapons drawn and aimed at them.
"I'll come."
Deep, gravelly voice rumbled from the shadows. It was Karel himself stepping into view, his cold eyes locking onto Ilara's. "You fought well, but your resistance is over. This planet belongs to us now. Lara's heart raced, but she stood. Tall, unbowed. "We'll never surrender," she said, her voice sharp and defiant. "We'll fight until the last breath." Corell's lips curled into a cruel smile. "Your bravery is admirable," he said, "but pointless. The moment you activated that distress signal, your fate was sealed." He turned to one of his subordinates. Nodding toward the console, "Destroy it. No one leaves this planet alive." With a flick of his wrist, the Deathworlder soldier moved toward the control console. Ready to pull the trigger, Ilara knew they didn't have much time. Their last chance was now no? She shouted, and in that instant, everything exploded into chaos. The team opened fire, their weapons blazing with bright energy beams that lit up the room in a deadly dance of light and fury. The Deathworlder soldiers responded immediately, their own weapons answering in kind. The room was filled with deafening gunfire, the air thick with smoke and the smell of burnt ozone. Ilara ducked behind a support column, her heart pounding in her chest. Her mind raced with calculations. If they didn't stop the Deathworlders from reaching the console, Zarkora would be lost forever. "Orin," she shouted over the noise, her voice strained with urgency. "We need to buy some time. Them get to the console." Orin nodded, his eyes burning with determination. On it. He sprinted across the room, firing his weapon at the advancing soldiers as he moved. He reached a side panel on the wall, activated a control sequence, and within moments, a series of heavy blast doors began to close off access to the power. Grid control room. Wasn't much, but it bought them a few precious seconds. Carol watched all of this with a cold, calculating gaze. "You cannot win," he said, stepping closer, unhurried. "You're already dead. It's just a matter of time." As his words echoed in the chaos, a low rumble sounded from deep within the planet's core. The Deathworlders seemed to take little notice, but Ilara's heart skipped a beat. It was the planet's energy reserves feeding power to the grid. She could feel the hum in the air, a sign that the system was still alive, barely if they could. Just reach the console. It could still turn the tide. But the Deathworlders weren't going to give them that chance. The soldiers pushed forward, closing in from every direction. Ilara and her team fought desperately, their weapons firing until their energy cells ran dry. Orin was knocked to the ground by a blast, but he managed to scramble to his feet, firing as he went. And then, in the midst of the chaos, Ilara saw the control panel. It was just beyond her reach, and the path to it was clear. She made the split-second decision. "I'm going for it," she shouted. "Ilara, no." Orin screamed, but it was too late. Ilara sprinted toward the control console, her feet pounding the metal floor. The air was thick with smoke, and her vision blurred from the heat of the battle. She could see Corell moving toward her, a cruel smirk on his face, but she didn't hesitate. She had to reach it. Just as she neared the console, a blast of energy slammed into her side, sending her crashing to the floor. Pain shot through her body, but Ilara gritted her teeth, forcing herself to stand. She was close, so close. With a final, desperate effort, she lunged forward, slamming her hand onto the control panel. A pulse of energy shot through her and the console lit up. It's a system coming back online with a bright flash. The room shook violently, and the hum of the power grid filled the air. Ilira's heart raced as she watched the energy field spring to life, forming a protective shield around the planet, but it was far from over. Kirill roared in fury, realizing too late what was happening. He tried to give the order to disengage, but the shields had already enveloped his fleet, trapping them in the atmosphere. Ilira's hands trembled as she held onto the console, the world spinning around her. She couldn't stop now. Shields were activated, but the Deathworlders weren't gone. It would fight until the last. Suddenly, a burst of fire erupted from the ceiling above, and a massive explosion rocked the building. The Deathworlder fleet had begun their final strike on the planet. It wouldn't stop unless the entire planet was obliterated. "No," Ilara whispered, her vision blurring. Her strength was waning. Orin's voice called out to her from across the room. "Captain, we've got to go." But Ilara knew there was no escape. The Deathworlders, would stop at nothing to destroy Zarkora. Even with the shields up, they had no time left. With a final desperate glance at her team, Ilara's mind flashed back to the day they first called for help. They had thought the Deathworlders would come as allies, but they had become the very thing they feared. Zarkora was lost. But Ilara had bought her people a chance, if only for a moment longer. Above, in the skies, the Deathworlder fleet launched its final assault. But it would be different now. Planetary shields stood strong. As the battle raged on, the Zorkalians fought to hold on, knowing their world would never be the same. And though Ilara's fate was sealed, her defiance had sparked something. In her people, a will to survive, a will to fight, and somewhere deep in the stars, the Deathworlders would learn that Zarkora would not be forgotten. The war was not over.